The afternoon was stifling, the kind of heat that draped over everything, making even the air feel sluggish. Jake had just come back from his daily run, his shirt soaked and clinging to his toned chest as he fumbled with his keys at the door. That's when he noticed her Mrs. Clark, his neighbor, sitting on her porch, lazily fanning herself with a glass of iced tea in hand. Despite the oppressive heat, she always managed to look composed. Her sundress was light and breezy, the fabric hugging her curves just right, and her dark hair was loosely pinned up, with a few strands resting against her flushed cheeks. She glanced at him, her gaze lingering a little too long on his sweat-slicked skin before a smirk spread across her lips, and she took a slow sip from her glass. Quite the workout. Her voice was soft and sultry, carrying a hint of playful teasing. There was something new in her gaze, something he hadn't noticed before. Jake paused, wiping sweat from his brow and offering a small nod. "Yeah, it's brutal out there," he replied, trying to keep his tone casual, though his heart raced under her steady stare. He had always seen her as the sophisticated older woman next door, but today felt different. The air between them seemed to hum with a charged, almost electric tension. Mrs. Clark rose slowly, adjusting the strap of her sundress that had slipped from her shoulder. "Well, you seem to handle it just fine," she said, her eyes still fixed on him. "Care for a drink? You look like you could use one." Jake hesitated briefly, but the offer, combined with the way she looked at him, was too tempting to resist. He nodded and stepped closer as she gestured for him to join her, a knowing smile curving her lips. He followed her inside, the cool air inside the house washing over him like a balm after the heat, but the tension only thickened in the cozy, dimly lit living room. Mrs. Clark handed him a glass of iced tea, her fingers brushing against his as she did. The touch lingered, sending a shiver through him. "You've grown up a lot since you moved in next door," she remarked, her voice low, almost like a purr, as she settled on the couch, slowly crossing her legs. The movement drew his eyes to the soft curve of her thighs peeking out from the hem of her dress. She noticed, of course, and the knowing smile she gave made his pulse quicken. Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his cool. "Yeah, I guess I have," he replied, sitting down beside her, a nervous energy buzzing through him. There was something magnetic about her, a pull he couldn't ignore. Mrs. Clark leaned in a bit, her fingers brushing against his knee and lingering as her eyes studied his face. "You've always been such a good boy, so polite. But I wonder, don't you ever get tired of it?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with suggestion. Jake's heart pounded, the weight of her touch and her closeness making his mind spin. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He didn't need to, his eyes spoke for him. Mrs. Clark's hand slid further up his knee, her touch slow and intentional. Jake's breath caught as she moved closer, her fingers grazing the inside of his thigh. The tension between them was undeniable, a constant, pulsing presence that filled the room. She leaned in, her lips brushing lightly against his ear as she whispered, "You don't have to be shy with me, Jake. I can see it in your eyes, the way you look at me." Jake's pulse raced, his skin tingling at her touch, and the coolness of the house suddenly felt stifling, as though the walls were closing in, amplifying each beat of his racing heart. He wanted her, he had admired her from a distance, but he had never let his thoughts go this far. With her so close, her scent intoxicating him, his restraint was slipping. Mrs. Clark leaned back slightly to meet his eyes, her hand still resting on his thigh, her thumb tracing slow circles on his skin. Her smile was gentle, but there was a hunger in her eyes that matched his own. "You don't have to pretend, Jake. I know you've thought about it." "About me," she murmured, her voice a seductive hum that sent another shiver through him. Jake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry as his gaze flicked from her lips to her eyes and back. He couldn't deny it now. He managed a nod, his voice barely a whisper. I have." Her smile grew, and she inched closer, her knee brushing against his. "Good," she whispered, her lips grazing his jaw as she spoke. "Because I've thought about you, too." Before he could respond, she closed the gap between them, her lips meeting his in a slow, deliberate kiss. It started soft, exploratory and teasing, but as Jake responded, it quickly turned more intense, more urgent. Her hand traveled higher up his thigh, the touch firmer, as if she had been waiting for this as long as he had. Jake's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, his fingers gripping the soft material of her sundress as their bodies pressed together. The kiss deepened, their mouths moving in unison, as if this was something they had done 100 times. Mrs. Clark's fingers threaded through his hair, tugging him closer still, her breath hitching as his hands slid up her sides, his touch gaining confidence. She pulled back just enough to catch her breath, her eyes dark with desire as she looked at him. "You don't know how long I've wanted this," she breathed, her voice husky and filled with longing. Jake's heart pounded wildly, his mind reeling as he absorbed her words. "Me too," he confessed, his tone rough and low, thick with the same desire that coursed through him. He leaned in, capturing her mouth in a kiss that was even more intense, more desperate than before. Mrs. Clark let out a quiet moan against his lips, her hands wandering across his chest, feeling the firmness of the muscles beneath his shirt. Jake could feel her body melting against his, her curves pressing into him as their kiss deepened. Her nails lightly scratched his skin, sending a shiver of anticipation through him. Her hands moved down to the hem of his shirt, tugging it up as her fingers brushed against the bare skin of his stomach. Jake broke the kiss just long enough to pull his shirt over his head, tossing it aside before his hands returned to her, slipping beneath the thin fabric of her dress. His fingers explored the smoothness of her back, tracing every curve and hollow as he pulled her closer still. Mrs. Clark's breath caught as his hands slid lower, fingers playing with the edge of her dress before moving upward, grazing the sides of her breasts. She let out a gentle gasp, her head falling back as Jake's lips found the sensitive spot on her neck, kissing and nibbling softly while his hands continued to explore her form. She arched into him, her body reacting to each touch, every kiss. "Jake," she whispered, her voice a blend of desire and urgency. He pulled back slightly, his gaze meeting hers, his hands still resting on her hips. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with a mix of longing and uncertainty. Mrs. Clark smiled, her fingers delicately tracing the line of his jaw as she leaned in, brushing her lips against his in a soft, reassuring kiss. "I've never been more sure of anything," she murmured against his lips before kissing him deeply again. That was all Jake needed to hear. His hands moved back up her body, sliding the straps of her dress off her shoulders, letting the material fall away, revealing more of her to his eager eyes. "Mrs." Clark's breath grew quicker as his hands roamed her body, his touch firm yet gentle, sending sparks of pleasure through her with every move. Jake's lips followed the path of his hands, kissing the newly exposed skin of her shoulders, her collarbone, and lower still, each kiss slow and deliberate, as if he wanted to memorize every inch of her. Mrs. Clark's hands slid into his hair, her head tipping back in pleasure as his mouth traveled downward, her body responding eagerly to every touch and kiss. The tension between them had become almost unbearable, the heat building to a fever pitch as their bodies pressed together, moving in unison. Every touch, kiss, and breath shared between them was filled with a passion neither had anticipated, but neither wanted to let go of. Jake's hands glided over Mrs. Clark's smooth skin, his fingers trailing down her sides and tracing the curves of her hips. He could feel the warmth of her body against him, her every response to his touch stoking a fire within him that he couldn't resist. As his hands moved, he reveled in the feel of her curves, the soft fabric of her dress, slipping away to expose her completely. Mrs. Clark let out a breathy gasp as Jake's hands wandered lower, his fingers brushing the curve of her waist, sending waves of heat surging through her. He explored her body with a mix of admiration and desire, his fingers gently outlining the shape of her hips, marveling at how she felt beneath his touch. She leaned into him, encouraging his exploration, her own hands sliding down his chest, feeling the defined muscles under his skin. "Jake," she breathed, her voice heavy with longing as she gripped his biceps, drawing him closer. The way her fingers clutched at him only fueled his need, urging him on. He pressed his lips to her collarbone, trailing kisses down to the soft swell of her chest, each touch igniting sparks of pleasure. He felt her heartbeat quicken beneath his lips as he moved lower, his mouth gliding over the soft fabric of her dress, breathing in her sweet scent. His hands traveled back up, resting on her waist before sliding over her hips, savoring the softness of her skin beneath his fingertips. Mrs. Clark's breath caught as he drew her closer, their bodies pressed tightly together, their heartbeats syncing in perfect rhythm. With a mischievous glint in his eyes, Jake lifted her slightly, adjusting their position so she straddled him on the couch. The sudden closeness sent a jolt through both of them, their bodies aligning perfectly. He could feel the heat radiating from her, driving his desire to new heights. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper, thick with yearning, as he gazed up at her, searching her eyes for confirmation. Mrs. Clark nodded, a sultry smile curving her lips. "More than okay," she replied, her fingers drifting down to his chest, tracing the lines of his muscles, savoring the feel of him beneath her touch. Her hands continued their journey, exploring the firm contours of his body, lingering on his sides, her fingertips brushing lightly over his ribs, teasingly close to where he wanted her touch most. Jake let out a deep, rumbling groan as her hands roamed over his chest, a heat building in his core as he pulled her even closer, their bodies perfectly aligned. He felt the smoothness of her legs against him, her bare thighs pressing into his hips, awakening a powerful desire within him. "God, you're stunning," he whispered, capturing her lips in another searing kiss, their mouths moving with an intensity that left them both breathless. Jake's hands slid to her thighs, gripping them tightly as he drew her closer, feeling the weight of her pressing into him as their kiss deepened. Mrs. Clark's hands drifted down to his waist, her fingers curling around the waistband of his shorts, lightly brushing against the fabric. Jake shivered under her touch, the anticipation growing with each teasing caress. She leaned back slightly, her eyes filled with longing as she met his gaze. "Don't be shy now," she teased, her voice sultry as she bit her lip, offering him a playful wink. "I want to feel everything." Her words stoked a primal fire inside him, and in one swift motion he gripped her waist, guiding her to move against him. The friction sent waves of pleasure through both of them, and they gasped together as the sensation coursed through their bodies. Jake's grip tightened on her hips, guiding her movements as they fell into a rhythm together. He felt her warmth pressing into him, the soft pressure driving him wild, her chest against his as their breaths mingled, losing themselves in the moment. Just like that, he murmured, his voice thick with desire as he watched her, captivated by the way she moved, her back arching and her lips parting with soft moans. Every glance and every touch brought them closer to the edge. Mrs. Clark leaned down, capturing his mouth again, her hands roaming over his chest and down to his abs, feeling the tension in his muscles as she touched him. She maintained control, playfully teasing him with her deep kisses, her tongue brushing against his, lighting a fire in his veins. When she pulled back, she bit her lip, her eyes glinting with mischief. "I've always wanted to be this close to you," she confessed in a hushed tone. "I never thought you'd feel the same." "Believe me," Jake replied, his gaze intense. "I've thought about this far more than I should have with that." He shifted, gently laying her back against the couch, his body hovering over hers. He leaned down, planting a trail of kisses across her chest, then down to the smooth skin of her thighs. The sensation of her legs wrapping around his waist made him moan with desire, and he relished the way she responded to his every touch, each kiss sending shivers through her. Jake's hands traveled higher, tracing every curve of her body, enjoying the softness of her skin beneath his touch. He could scarcely believe they had reached this moment, lost in each other, their bodies entwined in a passionate embrace. Each second crackled with electricity, a desire that was impossible to deny, with each caress stoking a fire that burned brighter with every heartbeat. As Jake kissed his way back up, he let his hands glide along her silky thighs, feeling the heat radiating from her as her legs pulled him even closer. He captured her mouth again, their lips moving in a fevered dance, tongues intertwining as flames of desire surged through them both. Mrs. Clark's fingers wove into his hair, drawing him deeper into the kiss as she let her hands explore the contours of his chest, tracing the firm muscles beneath his skin. "You feel so good," she whispered breathlessly against his lips, her breath warm and inviting. "Not as good as you," he replied, his voice thick with longing, as he kissed down the side of her neck, savoring the gentle curve of her collarbone. His hands slid up her sides, brushing over the soft swell of her breasts, sending shivers of pleasure through her. "Jake," she gasped, her back arching as he gently teased one of her nipples with his fingers, his mouth exploring the tender skin of her hips. The world around them faded, leaving only the magnetic connection they shared, their bodies moving in unison, every touch kindling a fire that seemed to consume them both. She pulled him back up, her eyes dark with desire as she caught his lips again, then whispered, "Let's not hold back anymore." With a mutual understanding, they surrendered to each other, their bodies intertwining, their hearts racing in sync as their kisses grew more fervent. Each touch sparked the air between them, hinting at what lay ahead. In that instant, nothing else mattered. They were lost in their own universe, consumed by a passion that had finally found its release. As they clung tightly to one another, their bodies entwined, they realized this was the beginning of something profound, a connection they knew they'd never want to end.